Aloha everyone, and welcome to the recording for this week's information on the various things that we'll be going over, including theories, strategies, and tools. I know that there's a lot of reading for this week, and there's a lot of information to put together. And so what I hoped on doing with this recording is just going over a little bit more the ideas behind theories, strategies, and tools to help you out when you put that together and begin building your components in your various assignments that will build towards that final project. And then also I want to discuss a little bit more about the different theories that you read about in your readings, just so that they might be a little bit more clear. I'll try to keep the recording no more than 20 minutes to half hour maximum. And if you have any questions, as usual, feel free to email your assigned TA or email me at any time. So without further ado, let me go ahead and start the recording. Start the lecture. First of all, let me talk a little bit about what I'm going to do. We talk a lot about components in this particular course. When you complete your final project, it will be made up of various components. Those components will consist of theories, strategies, and tools. And so it's my objective today to go over a little bit more exactly what we mean by that, so when you get to build those components towards your final project, they'll make a little bit more sense. Now, just keep in mind that there's many different ways of looking at online learning, and utilizing this particular approach is just another way of looking at how to dissect online learning, how to strategize for planning, how to think about the components, how to break it down to make it a little bit more understandable and a little bit more digestible, I guess you could say, rather than trying to tackle it from the standpoint of, gee, we have to solve all of the problems and we have to think about everything at one time. So this is just another way of looking at online learning, and there's many different ways, and there isn't any particular right or wrong way of doing that. So when we look at theories, understand that theories are just a set of principles that might justify a particular course of action. So think of a set of rules that we think is logical in doing something. So principles that we have, and we think, okay, this is our theory. These are the principles that we've put together that we think will justify taking a particular course of action, or thinking about it from the standpoint, if we do A, then B will most likely happen. So that's theory. If we do one thing, then most likely something else is going to happen as a result of that. So that's our particular theory. And I'm going to give examples to make these hopefully a little bit more clear as well. So understand strategies as well, and how they relate to theories. So theories are the underlying principles that guide us, and the strategy is the actual course of action that we take to solve a particular problem or to address a particular issue. So it's the actual course of action that relates to that particular theory. So in other words, we have a plan of action, it's based on a theory, and that plan of action is our strategy for how we're going to address that particular theory, or what we're actually going to do. So they relate to theories, and therein sometimes lies, what's the line that defines them. And therein might lie some ambiguity of the difference between a theory and a strategy. Well, the theory is the principles. The strategies is the plan for how we put those principles into action. You understand your theory, and then you act. And how you act Well, that's the tools that we use. So understanding that tools and how they relate to strategies and theories. The tools is just an artifact that can help you implement your strategy. It could be a textbook. It could be a pencil. It could be a video recording. It could be a PowerPoint with audio voiceover. It could be a lot of different things. So we're going to look at some examples, and just in a nutshell, the theory is how we're going to guide our principles for what it is that we want to look at from a learning perspective, what guides our actions. The strategy is the action that we take to address a particular desire for learning, particular approach to learning, and the tool is those artifacts that we use to implement those strategies based on sound theories. And so let's make some examples that perhaps will make that a little bit more concrete. And as we do that, I'm going to be relating these examples to your readings in addition to kind of make a little bit more clear perhaps some of the theories that are underlining some of the readings that we're looking at and particular approaches specifically with online learning. So these theories are much broader than just online learning. But for this particular course, I'll do as much as possible to relate them specifically to online learning environments because that's in what particular we're most concerned about. So if we looked at behaviorism, the theory of behaviorism is that you can change behavior by applying a particular stimulus. So that means that if we do a particular action, then we can lead others to change a particular behavior. And one of the key components of behaviorism is that it must be observed, that observation is a natural byproduct of behaviorism, that we have to be able to observe what the behaviors are, to be able to assess whether those behaviors are changing, and to be able to look at the learning that's involved with those addressing those behaviors. So changing behavior by applying a particular stimulus with observation as a key. A behaviorist, a pure behaviorist, someone that believed that this would be the most important way of implementing a learning strategy, particularly in an online learning situation, would say that everything is observable. But remember, in the real world, there's generally very few people that are pure in any particular area of theory belief. There are some, but most of the time you see people that have a belief in a different mixture of different types of theories. So if the theory is that we can change behavior by applying a particular stimulus, a strategy might be to create material that sequences learning in some fashion with observable feedback. So the theory, change behavior by applying stimulus. The action is to create material to sequence the learning and to be able to observe that in some fashion. How do we get that done? We use a tool. So a tool might be a video with the step-by-step instructions on driver education with embedded pre- and post-tests. So for example, you're trying to teach someone how to drive. So you might create a video. The video might say, okay, in order to drive, here are the steps that you take to be able to drive. You know, here's the ignition, here's the steering wheel, here's what you have to pay attention to. And to observe that the behavior is changing, that people are learning the ability to drive, you might have pre- and post-tests. You might have a test at the beginning to assess how much the learner already knows, and then you might have the same test at the end to ensure that the intervention, that the sequenced learning that you provided for them actually led to learning that you want them to. So an example of that, if we relate that to the David Thornburg article, might be the campfire. The campfire could be a screen with somebody delivering information as a possibility to a large group of people. So that's a possibility. It isn't the only particular way that we might do that, but it is a representation of how we might scaffold a behaviorist approach. So if we looked at it from the Thornburg staff files, maybe a lecture, so that's the campfire part. Well, you know, what would that look like? Well, it might look a little bit like what I'm doing today. So this is not a video, but it's an audio with some information. I don't have a pre and post test, but one of the things that I could have done in this course as a learning strategy is giving you a test before I asked you to take the video, to listen to the audio presentation. And then to take the same test afterwards to ensure that the objectives, that the information that I wanted you to learn was clear. So that might be one approach to that. Another one might be cognitivism. So this is another theory, different than behaviorism. So this theory relies heavily on memory. And memory is not always observable. So reflection and the brain are key to this particular theory. So basically, let's say this, a cognitivist would say that learning relies heavily on memory, and memory is not necessarily observable, so that reflection is key. So the active use of the brain is an important part of learning, not just the passive receipt of information that might be a more behaviorist, pure behaviorist thought, is that you give the information, someone receives the information and is able to absorb and then learn that information. A cognitivist says, no, the brain has to be working in some other manner other than just passively receiving the information. There must be some level of reflection that is processing that particular information. So strategy might be, rather than creating an audio step-by-step with a pre and post, or a video for driver's education, a strategy might be to provide information in chunks and require the learner to apply and synthesize that learning in some manner. So I could create material that can that could be a sequence of learning, but then I have to be able to observe the process of that information. So metacognition is just a fancy way of saying thinking about thinking. So the workings of the brain is key. So rather than that step-by-step pure approach, I might provide the information in chunks and require people to think about that information, process it in some way, some manner, reflect on it, and apply it. I might have them synthesize it by using it and thinking about it. So, what's an example of that? An online frog dissection simulation might be an example of that. So, rather than telling an individual step by step what the information is, I'm providing some information. Okay, here's the parts of the frog, but now go out in a simulation standpoint and see whether you can pick out the parts of the frog. Practice with it. Use the simulation. Can you do it on your own? So this might be related more to Thornburg's cave time. Can you process it on your own? Can you do the simulation not necessarily in a live environment or in a lecture environment, but that you can actually do some of it? That's only a possibility. But you must use your memory to recall in order to perform the action. So I give you the information about the parts of the frog, but when you're doing the simulation, you can't really look at the information, do the simulation at the same time. You can get close, but it's actually that actual action of using the brain, doing the reflection, and doing that thinking that's involved in putting that together. So that's a more cognitivist approach, the active working of the brain versus a behavioral that might tend to be a little bit more passive. These are extreme examples to illustrate the point. Obviously, most of these theories do have some kind of nuances with them. So that takes us to our next major theory. So we've talked about behaviorist, step by step, leading to a change behavior. Cognitivist, thinking about what it is that you want people to learn, having the brain be more active in the learning. And then there's constructivism. So this particular theory states that learning is affected by how one interprets and interacts with the world. So it's not just you can receive information. It's not just you have to think about information. It goes beyond that to say that we all have our own idea of the way the world works, a context. So we have our own interpretations, and how we interact with the world affects how we learn. So action is key. Learning is affected by how one interprets and interacts with the world, how one sees the world. So we call that an epistemology. That's just, once again, academic terminology for how one sees the world. So everybody has their own experiences. Everyone has learned different things over the course of their lifetime. So this affects how we interpret the world and how we learn. Those outside influences do play a valid role in our learning, and each of our realities might be valid in a different context. So constructivists would say that it's very important to understand the audience and what their preconceived ideas might already be as you build a set of learning experiences for them. So in a constructivist, how we interpret and how we act is important, and interaction is another important component. So strategy might be to give high-level, fuzzy problems that require group work. So in other words, rather than a particular set of actions that might lead to a desired result that's very straightforward in a behaviorist, or rather than having to complete a specific action that's known at the end using your brain power, like dissecting a frog. We kind of know what the answer might be. A constructivist might say for higher order thinking, you have to create problems that might not necessarily have one answer, and have those problems be processed in a group, so that that context, that frame of reference, the different realities of people comes into play. So let's provide a concrete example of that. If we go to our tools, we go from our theory, learning is affected by how one person interacts, strategy, high level, fuzzy problems, and teamwork. So our tool might be open-ended questions on an online learning discussion forum. So this might be something close to Thornburg's water cooler, the ability for people to discuss issues together, to challenge one another's understanding of their various realities, and then to come to some agreement about what the learning might possibly be. So, you know, and why we might call this talk story, that ability for people to process the information together. So open-ended questions, an online discussion forum. You might have individuals read something, look at something, video, high-level reading, discuss, meet with each other, and then respond in some reflective fashion to each other. So we're actually going to be utilizing this particular strategy this week in a more in-depth fashion than we did last week, which was just the instructions and respond. This week we're looking more for a reflection in a group setting, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a real-time live group setting. Obviously, One of the great things about an online course is that we can play with the flexible options that we have. So that's constructivism, that idea that, that context is important and interaction is also. And now we have a newer emerging theory. It's been around a while, but it's relatively newer, and that is connectivism. So it's kind of taking that idea of constructivism and then bringing in the modern idea of networking and connectedness. So one of the things that's key to this theory is that change requires constant learning and unlearning and a reliance on others. So in a connected world, there's a lot of new learning. There's a lot of challenging of learning that we already know, challenging of our assumptions, learning new things. And so sometimes that actually requires unlearning of what you already know to challenge your assumptions. And in order to do that, there's a reliance on others for knowledge. So that knowledge can no longer exist purely in one's own head, but that connection to people is important. It could be physical connection, but it could be networking connection as well. So learning requires processing from outside influences, and that could be other people, that could be software, that could be information that exists in a networked format, can be online knowledge, but the learning requires just-in-time access to this information as well. So not only is it connectedness, not only is it change, but it's that ability to get that information right when we need it to be able to challenge our assumptions or to lead to new learning. So one cannot learn on one's own, solely in isolation, like a philosopher of old days on a mountain or a monk with no outside influences. A pure connectivist would say, no, that interaction with knowledge that exists is an important part of learning, and you really couldn't have a higher order learning without that particular interaction. So strategy might be to require students to search for information and determine the relevance of that information collectively. So finding the information is only one part of it. That's connectedness. But taking that to the next level is sorting that information. One can sort good and bad information on one's own, but if one can have outside perspectives, then you might even make better determinations about the relevance of that particular information collectively. So we might ask them to go out and find something and then process it with others. So let's give a concrete example. Students search for open journals, create online posters. Maybe they create a web page that portrays the information that they found in the open journal that's related to a particular topic. And then other peers evaluate the reliability and validity of that work. So you could use open access journals. It's one thing that we're going to be doing in this particular course. We're not creating online posters, but we're creating component artifacts, and there will be a peer review process for that when we get to the final projects, that your peers will be able to look at the information that you collected and evaluate it in conjunction with the topic that you pick and the information that you create. So we might have the group be able to collectively evaluate and the reliability and validity. One of the things that you're doing in this particular course that we've added as a feature is being able to give our modules a star rating. So that is kind of an evaluation and validity process. You know, how good was the module in reaching the goals of what we wanted to reach. So we have a very connectivist approach. It's not a pure connectivist course, but connectivism plays a part in the things that we're doing. If we think of it from the Thornburg article, once again, then we might think of this as a combination of cave and water cooler, that ability to process information on one's own, but then bring it to other people as well. So almost using multiple strategies. So let me do a quick review before I move on to that. So principles, actions, and things, theories, strategies, and tools. The theories are the principles that help guide us. The strategies are the actions that we take to address those principles. And the tools are those things that we use to address our strategies. So an online environment, like I said, it could be audio conferencing, it could be video, it could be online discussion. There's a lot of different approaches. All of these things might be a little bit ambiguous now. Part of this audio was to try and hopefully make that a little bit more clear. But obviously you have your readings, you'll be able to practice these things. You'll have your peers for that as well. So now I just want to quickly go over an introduction to what our next area is going to be, and that is, in addition to understanding theories, strategies, and tools, also understand that one of the ways that I look at online learning is by understanding that I consider that there's 4 basic areas that should be included in every major online learning implementation. So that could be a course, it could be a site, it could be training, it could be a lot of different types of things. This isn't necessarily for something that's small, so if it was just an online resource that you put together to help some people understand a particular content area or a term or a definition, obviously this level isn't something that's for minor learning. It's for if you have a major unit, if you have an entire course, if you have a specific training, then to be most successful, these areas should probably be considered. And that is, obviously, it needs to have content, needs to have the information that allows for the learning. It should have an asynchronous component, meaning people able to process the information, not necessarily having to be there all at the same time, like a discussion. It should have a synchronous component if possible. So we have live sessions. They're optional, but we do have the opportunity for synchronous engagement, question and answers. And then there should be some level of assessment to make sure that the learning is appropriate as well. So we're going to get into that a lot in the coming weeks, and we'll define it further. We'll relate it to personality inventories, intelligences, what it looks like from a tool implementation. So all of these things will be covered in a particular area. But I call this the casa technique, the mi casa es su casa, and you'll read that in my article that, in the Mexican tradition, my house is your house is more than just I invite you to my house. It's that idea that you have to be a good host. Not only do you allow people in your house, but you have to make the experience important to them. You have to make them understand that they're important when they're a visitor to your house. So as much as possible, I like to think of my online learning environments as by casa, that I'm inviting my students to, and to know that their experience is important and that they're valued guests in that particular environment as well. Once again, thank you for listening to the recording. Thank you for your participation in the course, and as always, you may email myself or the TA for questions at any time.